All right, feature number 4, life in the city. This is rather artistic, but I couldn't resist. I love this painting, which I hadn't seen before I put this together. And it is technically just a little bit beyond the Gilded Age because of the cars there, but it's pretty close. But I wanted to give a sense of daily life in the cities. Not that it looked this kind of pretty and nice for everybody. It certainly didn't. We've already looked at disparate differences in lifestyles and places of dwelling. Nonetheless, the cities in America were becoming more livable in general in this period. So I wanted to put something on the screen that reflected that it wasn't all sort of gloom, doom and gloom, and wasn't all sort of gray and sort of damp and dirty everywhere all the time. So I'm doing this somewhat tongue-in-cheek, like I'm doing like a sightseeing brochure, what to do in New York City. Like there's not a lot to do. But one of the things that struck me when I first did this, put this together, was how many of the things that you could do are still true to this day. I'm not saying there isn't more to do in New York City now, but there was still quite a bit to do even then. Now, in some cases, you had to be able to afford to do it, so it did leave certain people out. A lot of the new immigrants we talked about would have been prohibited, at least in their early years here, but not from all of these things, but some of them. Our beloved textbook author, James Rourke, says cities became more beautiful with the creation of urban public parks to complement the new buildings that quickly filled city lots. Those two buildings on the left and right are drawings, paintings of real buildings in New York City, famous ones, and those are good-looking buildings. So you could see how walking the streets would be interesting. I love to go to big cities and walk the streets and sort of gawk at the skyscrapers and all of the stores and everything else that are there. Things to do in New York City: take a walk in Central Park. The indefatigable Frederick Law Olmsted, pictured on the left, America's premier landscape designer, designed parks in Atlanta, Boston, Brooklyn, Hartford, Detroit, Chicago, and Louisville, as well as the grounds for the U.S. Capitol. Not bad. Best remembered, however, for the creation of New York City's Central Park. Completed in 1873, it became the first landscaped public park in the U.S. 800 acres of area, which is, if you've never been to New York City and you've never seen this from this kind of view before, in the upper left from an airplane, of course, look at that. That's Manhattan, right in the middle of Manhattan. That's a large chunk of the city that's now, ever since the Gilded Age, been carved out as this huge park. And look at this is of course a modern photograph on the right, but again I wanted to give you a sense of the beauty of this park. Olmsted knew what he was doing in this and other parks that he built. He said, "We want a place where people may stroll for an hour, seeing, hearing, and feeling nothing of the bustle and jar of the streets." So the idea was to make cities more livable, more things to do, to get away from the noise and the everything else that can be the downside of cities. So, but anyone that goes to New York City, almost everyone, right, will go to Central Park. I go to it every time I've been to New York City. At least I go to there at least once. So it's certainly a sight to see if you ever do get there. See, I sound like I'm a sort of a tourist guide or something, a tour guide, or I'm selling you, some sort of tour. Things to do in New York: spend the afternoon shopping. Yes, you could even then. On the left, Marshall Fields in Chicago. I forget the name of the store at the bottom. Kind of see it down there. It's in Seattle. It was in Seattle. But this is really the beginnings of department stores. There were some in London around this time as well. But now we're used to Macy's, which also basically was around this time as well, founded during this era. But we're used to all kinds of department stores. But this was something new. And this is the kind of a transition period, the move to a consumer economy in these kind of new types of stores. Richard White informing us that the new department stores indicated a shift from producer to consumer goods, but the change did come gradually. Marshall Field, a wealthy capitalist businessman, while maintaining a thriving wholesale business, opened his flagship retail store on State Street in Chicago in 1893. So Field had first made good money, made a fortune doing wholesale. So producer goods instead of consumer goods. Producer goods are sort of things like a plow, plows for farmers, right? That's not for consumption. It's for work. It's for a job. So Field had made his first fortune in that kind of goods, and now he builds a department store, and then others to follow. And the painting on the left, right, shows how. I mean, it's a painting on a picture, but it did look like that. How extravagant these things could be, and some of them still are, of course. In fact, Wanamaker's in New York City, another a big one from this time period. Sometimes those things are some of them are still around, or the buildings insides are still around. So we love as Americans to shop today, especially at nice stores. And so imagine when this was all brand new, how impressive it would be to walk into a place like that with that many sort of floors and that elaborately decorated, and beautiful on the inside. It must have been stunning to people. We're used to it now, so it's not big of a deal. But again, there's a bit of presentism in that. If you've never seen a department store before, again, it's just a painting. But imagine walking in for the first time and seeing that, especially if you were poor. Like, wow, this is incredible. And there's stuff on sale here, and even if you couldn't afford it, it'd be fun to look around and as it is sometimes window shopping, which I don't really like, by the way. I like to go in and buy stuff. I'm a capitalist, I guess. Things to do in New York City. 10 hours of fun for 10 cents. Take the kids to Coney Island. You can stay there for 10 hours on 10 cents. That ain't bad. 10 cents was more then, of course, but still pretty cheap entertainment. So this is something that you didn't have to be a rich person to afford. Again, you could go to the department stores even as a poor person and just look around. But you probably couldn't afford much, if anything. Brands, one of my go-to historians here, says electricity gradually supplanted steam power, improving the workplace by allowing greater energy flexibility. What? I have the wrong quote here. My bad. I don't know how that happened. Did I already? Yeah, I did already read this. So anyway, Coney Island is sort of like the first big kind of amusement park, a strip of territory in Brooklyn on the water, and kind of like the boardwalk at Santa Cruz, only larger and kind of more impressive. And there were already rides. You can see in the upper right, and sort of new rides coming all the time. Merry-go-rounds were in fashion then, they're still around to this day. So it's a place you could take family, your kids, and hang out. All kinds of things to do. Some nightlife. There were things to eat. Dance halls, penny arcades, all kinds of interesting things to do there. I don't know how I got the wrong quote on that. My bad. Things to do in New York City. Go out on the town. So of course, a lively nightlife. None of this surprises you, of course, since New York is known for having a lot to do. The city that never sleeps, which is almost literally true. But it might surprise us, I guess, a little bit that it goes this far back. Rourke writes, the growing anonymity of urban industrial society posed a challenge to traditional rituals of courtship. Young working women no longer met prospective husbands only through their families. Fleeing crowded tenements, the young sought each other's company in dance halls, where drinking was part of the evening's entertainment. The lower left drawing there, you can see one of the most famous of the dance halls and kind of nightclubs at the time. On the right, you see kind of more highbrow entertainment at a theater. Vaudeville in the upper left, not as highbrow, but certainly very popular and sometimes with lots of talent. And of course, Broadway, theater in time as well. So New York City. If you're bored in New York City, something is wrong. But that was true even in the Gilded Age. Things to do in New York City: go catch a ball game. Baseball, America's pastime. Maybe not any longer, though it's still my favorite sport. But it goes way back. So, as Mark Twain said, baseball is the very symbol, or at least he believed, the outward visible expression of the drive and push and rush and struggle of the raging, tearing, booming 19th century. So he thought that baseball was a symbol of the whole 19th century, or the whole sort of Gilded Age. There were already, at this time, professional teams sort of starting in leagues and kind of trying to form around teams that are already created, and get a group of teams. Okay, let's form a league together, etc. One commentator has said the genius of our institutions, commentator at the time, baseball leader, said the genius of our institutions is democratic, and baseball is a democratic game. In some ways, that's true. It wasn't that expensive to go to these games either. So, average working class folks could show up and be entertained as we are at sporting events today. They're just much more expensive now. But I say, because baseball was already becoming famous and would continue to be, or infamous, I should say, for segregation. Not allowing African Americans to play in all white leagues, which led to the Negro League or Negro Leagues. And in some ways, this may have been a blessing in disguise. Because the Negro Leagues had fantastic talent there, and kind of concentrated African American talent in one league eventually. At first, it wasn't one league. What we talk about usually now is the Negro Leagues. That comes a little bit later, I think in the 1920s. Here, there's kind of a number of them. They're kind of starting and stopping, starting and failing, both the white leagues and the African American ones. But baseball's color line, of course, would not be breached until Jackie Robinson, one of the great sports figures in all of history, for his not only his talent but his incredible courage, because he was under gigantic pressure as the sort of the first crossover African American star in Major League Baseball. But that comes decades after this. So segregation in baseball and other sports was sadly and horrifically the norm. Things to do in New York City: try some of the finest cuisine. Maybe the most famous restaurant of all was Delmonico's. It was expensive, so this wasn't something everybody would go to, and a lot of high society, highbrow talent. In fact, the quote from Richard White here is about a dinner given for James G. Blaine in 1884. He was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and he was running for president, and he had just won the Republican nomination for the presidency. He ended up not winning in the general election, but this is a celebration of his victory in the primary. And I love the quote and the imagery. The American cooking no longer, as Europeans reported earlier in the century, offended every sense but hearing. In New York, at least, the Americans were open to trying different cuisines. But chefs at Delmonico's did not just bring French cooking to the U.S., they garnished it with American excess, which is kind of like how we do with everything, right? Pizza. I mean, I love American pizza because I've grown up on it. But it's like nothing like Italian pizza. Americans put way more cheese, and which I'm all for it, but I can see how Europeans are like, God, these Americans just do everything to excess. Anyway, Blaine's banquet proceeded from oysters through seafood soups, hors d'oeuvres, or hors d'oeuvres, Americans say, 3 kinds of fish, beef, sorbet, fowl, and desserts. Wow, it was certainly restrained compared to the artificial lakes and swimming swans that sometimes grace society dinners at the restaurant. Even the diners looked avian, meaning bird-like, with the women adorned in their feathers and the tuxedoed male diners looking like so many cigar-smoking penguins. So I can't resist the imagery in that quote, so I always have to include it. Feature number 4, at work in the city. Now not the not so pleasant stuff, the stuff you had to do to be able to afford some of those entertainments in New York City. The number of wage workers, again, our very lovable textbook author says, in the United States exploded in the second half of the 19th century, more than tripling from 5.3 million in 1860 to 17.4 million in 1900. More than half the country's men, women, and children made up the laboring class that performed manual work for wages. That's a gigantic boom in industrial workers. 5.3 million to 17.4 by 1900. 40 years, it more than tripled. And again, much of this is immigrant labor coming from different parts of the world. They usually found jobs, not always. There was domestic work, which women often took jobs there. There's white-collar work that's on the rise as well. But for the most part, especially immigrants, usually took low-paying jobs in factories, sweatshops, plants, etc. So Rourke says, common laborers formed the backbone of the labor force. They built the railroads, subways, tunneled under New York City's East River to anchor the Brooklyn Bridge, and helped lay the foundation of industrial America. These human machines stood at the bottom of the country's economic ladder and generally came from the most recent immigrant groups, like Slavs and Italians. Further, saying, at the opposite end of labor's hierarchy stood skilled craftsmen like iron puddler James J. Davis. Not famous, Rourke just picked this guy out as an example. A Welsh immigrant who worked, again, northern and western Europe here, who worked in the Pennsylvania mills, iron steel mills. Using brains along with brawn, puddlers took up the melted pig iron in the heat of the furnace and formed the cooling metal into 200-pound balls. The heat is so great, he said, that if my body was not hardened to it, the ordeal would drop me in my tracks. Possessing such a skill meant meant earning good wages. So part of what's being said here is that the people that had the more skilled, high-paying jobs tended to be immigrants from, or descendants of immigrants from Northern and Western Europe by this time. This guy was himself a Welsh immigrant, but had probably been there for longer than many of the Italians and Hungarians and Russians that were coming in. So most people are in factories. On the left is a steel mill. On the right is a textile or a garment sweatshop. Women in the workforce. Most families that at least came from Europe as immigrants during the Gilded Age had to have everybody in the family work to afford to live, to survive, to pay the rent. Work again. In the late 19th century, the number of women workers also rose sharply, with their most common occupations changing slowly from domestic service to factory work and then again to office work. So on the right, you see women working in a factory. On the left, you see them now with clerical jobs. A lot of women sitting at one typewriter. You know what that job was called? The person, it's like, if somebody's a plumber, you say, hey, that's a plumber. Someone's a lawyer, that's a lawyer. You know what you said about this person? That's a typewriter. I'm not kidding. They were called typewriters, which, I mean, it's like saying lawyer or plumber, but it somehow does seem kind of demeaning, calling someone a typewriter. It probably didn't seem that way then. It's probably a certain amount of presentism, and I'm using it, but I can never get past saying that without thinking, wow, that's a demeaning way to talk about that person. As they're not a person, they're a typewriter, but it is a description of their job. Child labor in the Gilded Age. When I said whole families had to work, I meant it. So child labor was perfectly legal, though it is in this period where we start to see the beginnings, at least, of reform to try to end child labor, and some headway made with legislation, although it won't be complete until a later date. But some of the pictures are incredible. I love the picture on the right. Young guys, young kids smoking, trying to look like adults. But some of these kids had to grow up fast on the streets, had to have their wits about them to survive. Sometimes they're doing it on their own, orphaned or kicked out of their house by parents for whatever reason. I mean, sometimes kicked out for good, and had to survive on their own, again through their own wits, on the streets of Philadelphia or New York. I think the picture on the right, the kids were actually on strike. Those actually too are Newsies. I don't know if you've seen Newsies before the movie, but I think it was during a strike where the kids actually went on strike. Boot blacks in the center, a fairly common job in the cities for kids. Dealing with shoes, and many of these kids were sort of paupers and homeless, etc. The picture on the left just always blows me away. You see a child there, I don't know, 9, 10 years old, and a lot of things sort of jump off the screen here. One is the child looks dirty, right? The clothing looks dirty, barefoot in a factory, doesn't necessarily look totally healthy, and maybe most striking of all, right behind is what looks like potentially very dangerous machinery. That's a textile mill. But you can just picture, I mean, I don't want to picture it, but you can just picture a child reaching in there unknowingly to get something and having a hand chopped off, which certainly, things like that happen. But this is partly why we are horrified by the idea of child labor today, and a growing number of Americans at the time even were. The 1900 census showed approximately 1.7 million children in the workforce. Professor Rourke on this, in the cities, boys as young as 6 years old plied their trades as bootblacks and newsboys. Often working under an adult contractor, these children earned as little as 50 cents a day. Many of them were homeless, orphaned, or cast off by their families. One said, "We was 6 and we ain't got no father." A child of 12, we had no father. A child of 12 told Jacob Reese, the guy who wrote "How the Other Half Lives." Some of us had to go. So a lot of these kids are pretty tough because they had no choice. But again, eventually laws are coming that makes all this illegal. But it's shocking to us to think that this happened at all. There were child coal miners in the Gilded Age, usually immigrants. They were like 10, 12 years old that spent the whole day, 6 days a week in the coal mine. Coal mining is dangerous, and you usually don't live like past 40, or not much past that. If you start when you're a little kid, it's probably less than that. Black lung disease, other problems. So the economy was vicious to immigrant children, at least from poor families. Most of them were poor families. But to look at it from the other side, the families knew it was dangerous, and they had no choice. And they probably wouldn't have wanted there to be laws saying, "Hey, your child can't go into the factory. It's against the law. It's too dangerous." What are you talking about? We need the income. We need the money. We can't afford to not have our son or sons working, however old they are. So it kind of cuts in a couple of directions. But oftentimes the reformers weren't looking at it from the perspective of the people that they were trying to help. Organized labor, another part of work in the cities, since the Gilded Age sees urbanization happen and steam and then electric power be applied to industry, which meant that all factories could and usually did locate in cities. Then sort of the place that unions really organized and had their headquarters and made their influence was in cities. So the big organization, at least at the beginning of the labor organization, at the beginning of the Gilded Age, was the Knights of Labor that you see here. Terence Powderly, its head, in the bottom right. This is a rather radical organization. Under Powderly, the Knights became the most powerful force in labor, at least in the 1880s. They were eventually outdone by the American Federation of Labor, AFL, under Samuel Gompers. So they kind of went away, but they had some striking success and got a lot of workers involved in labor activity for a time. The organization promoted workers' democracy, which included public ownership of railroads, an income tax, abolition of child labor, and equal pay for women. And that one was pretty much ahead of its time, at least in America. It called for one big union, kind of the strength in numbers principle, which we'll get back to in our unit on dissent, depression, and war. But the Powderly and others recognized that the more workers you can have in one organization, the more clout you have. If this could never happen, of course, in reality, but just to give an extreme example to make the point very clearly, if all of America's workers were organized in one union, most Americans today aren't organized in any unions, but if all of them were organized in one union, can you imagine the power that the union would have, its leader and leaders would have? They could walk in to see the president whenever they wanted to. If they threatened to go on strike, it would mean the whole country would shut down. So, again, it would never happen. But you see the idea of strength in numbers taken to its logical extreme. So Powderly was certainly right. So we'll see other labor leaders, understood as well that the more people, in this case, more unions that belong to organization as kind of an umbrella organization from different industries, the more power and clout you have to get things done for your workers, the more power you can acquire. They wanted to create a cooperative commonwealth, as it was called, that would end class conflict, and the wage labor system. And this then starts to have Marxist look to it. I don't know if Powderly had read Karl Marx, uh, since this is sort of just at the end of Karl Marx's life, but he probably had at least some familiarity, because these are strikingly similar concepts, and in some ways I would argue then unrealistic concepts, since Marxism has by now proven not to have worked. As much as it's come back in popularity in recent years, and even right now, its track record is terrible. So I would advise you to read up on it thoroughly. Karl Marx is a fascinating intellectual to understand. There's a tremendous impact on world history. But I think Marxism has had its chance, and the fact that it keeps coming back, it's kind of the failed idea that never dies. But again, I'm not sure if Powderly was a Marxist, at least an avowed Marxist, but it appears there was at least an influence here, if not more. From the Knights of Labor perspective, Powderly's perspective, for sure, the only people denied membership were people in jobs and professions that were labeled parasites. Lawyers, stockbrokers. So another way that this looks typically Marxist, in that it looks like the blame is being placed on the capitalists and on the rich guys. That it's sort of a simplistic poor versus rich. How come you're poor? Because these guys are rich and they're ripping you off. I'm not saying there's never any truth to that. Of course, there's some truth to that, but it's not quite as simple, I think, as that. Though we like to think it is, because it keeps us from having to think about things, in a too complex a fashion. But the world, unfortunately, history, unfortunately, is quite complex. The Knights actually opposed strikes in theory, though they didn't oppose boycotts, but they actually were involved in a number of strikes nonetheless, and they won one big victory over a railroad owned by Jay Gould, who will meet in a later unit. Defeating Jay Gould in a strike is saying something, and so the popularity and membership in the Knights of Labor went up big time after that sort of well-publicized victory over the difficult to challenge Jay Gould. So two major labor events that sort of happen in cities, right, smack in the middle of the Gilded Age. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877, which spread to a lot of cities. Baltimore, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Chicago, St. Louis, San Francisco, etc., etc. This is the first national strike ever. It was partly a result of a depression that had started a few years ago in 1873. Railroad workers were protesting by the time the strike broke out. That's what caused them to strike. Speed ups, meaning they were forced to work faster, pressured to work faster with no pay increase, and wage cuts at the same time. And this finally caused one after another group of workers in this city and that city, this railroad, that railroad, and sort of all eventually going out. Not all rail workers, but many of them. All those participating kind of cooperating together, even if they were in different worked for different railroads. It got so rough and tough, violence. You can see the picture on the right. Troops brought in, state militias brought in, sometimes who refused to fire on workers because they saw them as sort of in the same position as themselves, but not always. So there was violence on both sides, lots of destruction of property. Eventually, at its height, about 500,000 workers were on strike across the country. So great railroad strike it was. 8 governors eventually called for President Rutherford B. Hayes, another guy you probably haven't heard of before. Don't worry, most people have not. They called for him to send federal troops, which he was reluctant to do, but he finally did. and the strike was put down everywhere, though the federal troops weren't really involved in violence. What they really did that helped to defeat the strike is sort of come in and establish kind of law and order, and it kept the strikers from being able to do what they wanted to do. But there were some casualties, dozens of people, killed again across the nation, and the strike was in the end defeated. Privately, the president noted that the workers' grievances were legit and thought the railroad owners were greedy as hell, but felt compelled, whether it was right or wrong, to side with sort of law and order in this case. The picture on the right depicts fighting that took place in Baltimore, Maryland. We'll see this again later, but the labor conflicts of the Gilded Age were brutal. These were wars. I mean, they really were wars, small-scale ones, but basically, military combat, as well as other things. The other big city labor event from this period is the Haymarket Affair, 1886. The incident, this is in Chicago, big city, came about because of a national labor campaign for an 8-hour day. So many unions working together, workers all across the country. So again, kind of a national strike. But it wasn't one big strike. It was a lot of different types of actions going on, all in support of pressuring for an 8-hour workday, which wasn't in place yet. Of course, they wouldn't be working for it. In Chicago, at a place called the McCormick Reaper Works, famous company that made industrial farm machinery, workers were fired upon by police demonstrating one day, and one worker was killed. And the workers, were enraged. So next night, a meeting was called at Haymarket Square, Chicago, the same city, and radical speakers, some of them anarchists, socialists, made fiery speeches denouncing this and that, denouncing capitalism, angry at the police killing one of the workers, etc. And the whole evening's event was about to wind up. It had been peaceful up until that time, and the police showed up, dozens of them, and were there to break the thing up. It was almost done, and they were going to break it up. Why? I don't know. And in one of those things that happens all too often in history, somebody started violence, and sort of, all hell broke loose. Somebody threw a bomb into the crowd of policemen, killing and wounding dozens of them. And we don't, even to this day, know who did it. The authorities arrested 8 anarchists, some of whom were convicted on very little evidence. Some of the guys convicted were actually on stage making the speeches when the bomb, was thrown or went off, so they couldn't have thrown the bomb, though they could have been involved in the plot that set the thing in motion. It's possible. Whether any of the anarchists or all of them, accused, did it or not, it appears that they were convicted, those that were, more because they were anarchists and seen as dangerous than whether or not they did it, because the evidence was fairly slim. That doesn't mean it's not possible that one or more of them were involved, but the evidence was still slim and probably wasn't enough to convict, except that the court system, the judge, the jury, were frightened of anarchists, and the mentality was, well, even if they didn't do it, we think anarchists are dangerous, so let's put them behind bars. So it was an injustice, even if the guys did it. But this set back the labor movement by years, because the press that tended to be on the side of the corporations, strikers were fighting against, partially because the newspapers media were big companies themselves, capitalists themselves, but they tended to sort of take these kind of events and use them to make the strikers and workers sort of all look like bomb-throwing radicals and criminals, which of course we see happening, even in recent events, even in the current present day. There's still a tendency for the media to sort of pick out the most extreme and sort of really publicize that. So the labor movement really got a black eye because of this. They really got sort of punched, broken jaw that took them a long time to recover from. Feature number 5, city government, the machine system, and the beginnings of reform. The bottom right, you see Tammany Hall, which really became the effective center of New York City local politics. The machine or boss system is an extremely interesting one, and Wilford McClay, I think, describes it really well. I asked to start with my own question, did anyone benefit from this? The answer, I think, just from reading this quote is clearly yes. However corrupt it may have been, that it was, a new form of urban politics sprang up in such circumstances of the Gilded Age to address the needs of disoriented urban dwellers, many of whom were new not only to urban life, but to the United States itself. Such individuals often found themselves in desperate need of the services of city government, but were unsure how to gain access to them. Such matters were increasingly handled through powerful and well-positioned political bosses and their machines, informal but highly disciplined networks of influence and office holding generally tied to the Democratic Party, which worked according to the age-old patterns of bribes and payoffs, patronage and graft, buying and selling votes. At bottom, it was an intricate system of mutual favors. I scratch your back, you scratch mine. It was thoroughly corrupt, and the bosses got rich from it. But at the same time, the political machines took care of urgent needs for their constituents. That describes it very well. Let's unpack this a little bit. Why was it the Democrats that were sort of in control of so many of these city machines? Well, it's because the arrival of immigrants in huge numbers, right, were potential new voters. It didn't take nearly as long to become a naturalized citizen in those days, so people could come into the country and start voting in the not too distant future. And it was the Democrats who, by this time, were becoming known as kind of the party of the less fortunate or the underprivileged. And immigrants were certainly that. So it's a constituency that was sort of already in their wheelhouse, and the Republicans didn't seem as interested. So the Democrats were all over it. Part of it because they cared about immigrants, some of them, but a lot of this was political. It's like we've got these people, streaming in by the millions from other countries, and we're going to make sure that almost all of them become Democrats, and it'll enhance our power and we'll win more elections and so forth. Democratic operatives, officials would go down to the docks and meet immigrants coming off the boats from Ellis Island, just landing, setting foot on New York soil, American soil for the first time, and saying, "Hey, you got a place to stay? I got a job. Here's some numbers for you. I can help you out and get you started. Why don't you follow me over here? And don't forget, it's the Democratic Party that did this for you, and give them a card or whatever, and get their I don't know, figure out where they live and come back and talk to them again another day. So help them out, but then they help you out. Scratch your back, all right? I scratch yours, you scratch mine. At the local level, there were bosses kind of in each neighborhood, ward bosses they were called. Part of the system. It was a top-down pyramid, kind of system. And the ward bosses would be like the guy, the political power in that neighborhood. And maybe it's a well-to-do person, successful person in the neighborhood. Maybe it's a guy who owns a saloon that makes a lot of money, a bar. And let's say you live there in 1890, and you're poor, and your cousin, I'm making this as I go, hypothetical, your cousin gets arrested for a drunken brawl, and he ends up, harming the other guy, breaks a beer bottle and slashes him with it, and the guy's in the hospital. And so your cousin's in jail. And you're trying to do something to help him get out of jail. You don't think he actually was at fault. The other guy was at fault, or you're at least going to say that. And so you get an appointment with the ward boss. He's from your neighborhood. You might even know him. Those wards are actually pretty small neighborhoods, so you might know each other, if not friends, to school together, or from the same block. And so you get in, actually have FaceTime with the ward boss, and you tell him the story. Well, my cousin got arrested. He's in jail right now, and but I don't think he did it. I think he got treated unfairly. The other guy is the real culprit, and he didn't get arrested. I'm wondering if there's something you might be able to do. And the ward boss would probably start saying, nothing I could. I don't know why you came to me. I don't really have that kind of clout. I could, I guess, talk to, some of the, people in the Democratic Party, or machine up higher, but I don't think I could really do for him. Although I kind of got his hand out, and you're having to put like 20, 40, 60, whatever dollars in his hand, and he's still kind of hemming and hawing, and then finally he kind of pockets the money and says, "Well, let me see what I can do. Maybe I can make a few calls, and I'll get back to you." And sure enough, a week later or 3 days later, your cousin is miraculously sprung from jail, all charges dropped. So totally corrupt, right? You paid the guy off, you bribed him to get with his connections, and move the system in favor of your cousin based on a bribe. And that system needed to go away. Corruption needs to be eliminated when and where it can. However, it did help the people, because that guy who was trying to help his cousin, got FaceTime with the politician and could get things done that way. When the system does get reformed, and the corruption is gone, or lessened, you get a politician instead of a ward boss who comes to your neighborhood to make a campaign speech and waves and smiles and kisses babies and shakes hands, and then is whisked off in his whatever transportation. You never see him again. You never get FaceTime with him. You could show up to his office and talk to an assistant or a secretary, but you never talk to that guy. So this system had at least the benefit of being more hands-on and being more user-friendly. But I would still argue the corruption needed to go. George Washington Plunkett, one of the Tammany Hall leaders, talked about honest graft. Funny phrase, an oxymoron. He also said, this is hilarious. I'll read it, and you can see if you figure out what he's saying. I'll explain it afterwards. When you've voted them with their whiskers on, you take them to a barber shop and scrape off the chin fringes. Then you vote them again with the side lilacs and a mustache. Then to a barber again. Off come the sides, and you vote them a third time with the mustache. If that ain't enough, and the box can stand a few more ballots, clean off the mustache and vote them plain face. That makes one of them good for 4 votes. He said, you take a guy that's got a lot of facial hair, take him down to the polling place, have him vote, and then go shave off, part of his hair, I don't know, his beard, and then vote again, and then go have the barber shave off his mustache, so he looks like 4 different guys. And it's easier to do voter fraud than that it's not ever done today, but we hear about it in the news all the time, but it was surely easier to do then. But Plunkett was, basically bragging, kind of making a joke about how easy it was to, stuff the ballot box, people voting multiple times. The most famous and successful machine boss was William Boss Tweed, who dominated New York City politics in the early part of the Gilded Age until his sort of whole gig crashed around him as the authorities swept in. His associates and he became known as the Tweed Ring. And of course, as I said about machine systems already, this is kind of the model machine system. So these kind of things spread to other cities across the country, as far away as Kansas City and all across the country. But the boss system, political machine, was the kind of corrupt system that we've talked about before. And this guy was just the most successful at it in the biggest city. Richard White tells us to truly govern New York City required controlling the city's hopelessly unwieldy government and the state legislature. Tweed did both. He dominated Tammany Hall, city government, through a network of Democratic clubs in every ward and assembly district. Tammany, in turn, controlled New York City. Tweed held no city office himself, but he was a state senator and chair of the State Senate's Finance Committee. So he was perfectly positioned. He and his ring, 3 other guys, one of whom was the mayor at one point. The other 3 held different positions. At least in this city politics, he tended to stay kind of in the background in the shadows, but he was clearly the leader of this group. And all the while, though he was doing some things, like I read in the quote from the last slide, that can be seen to have helped his constituency. He was an Irish American, and there were a lot of Irish Americans in New York at the time, so a lot of people loved the guy, and were aghast when he got arrested. But he got arrested because he was a criminal. He was committing crimes left and right, and he became super, super rich by pilfering from the city. White goes on to say, in his corruption, greed, and ability to knit together government and private capital, he was not that different from Huntington or Jay Gould. White is, in a sense, defending him to a degree by saying some of the capitalists, Collis B. Huntington of the Central Pacific Big Four, he's saying he wasn't much more of a crook than those guys. Just a government official, not a capitalist, but still doing many of the same shenanigans. But it eventually caught up with him. It was obvious to some because of the salary of both a local politician, and he didn't have an office anyway, or an elective position, or a state politician. It wasn't that high. And yet he was living, in this gigantic house, and he was open, about, his lifestyle. He didn't say where he got the money, but so there was suspicion around there. Some people must have, known something was up early on, but it carried on for quite some time until certain people, particularly a writer and editor at the New York Times, made this sort of a big project of theirs, big investigative journalistic program, and was in alliance with Thomas Nast, a famous political cartoonist for another paper in New York, who just in many, many cartoons, he's one of the most famous ones on the left, just went after Boss Tweed, who's the guy in the front left, the big guy with the hat on his hand, and everybody's kind of pointing his direction, sort of leaving him holding the bag in the end. So Nast was pitiless in his criticism of Boss Tweed, it apparently even affected Tweed, as he said, the cartoons even more than the newspaper articles themselves. They were also scathing. So the New York Times in 1871, in a story called headline, I don't have the actual headline as you can see, so I sort of rigged it, but gigantic frauds of the ring exposed. And they had tons of evidence. A new city auditor working for the city sort of figured out, or at least at first noticed the books are screwed up here, something's wrong, and then started to get suspicious about why, and put the pieces together and realized and had the numbers and the evidence that these guys are cooking the books. Tweed and his sort of three henchmen who formed the Tweed Ring. So the New York Times, the city auditor, forget his name, and Thomas Nast, the cartoonist, combined basically to bring the Tweed Ring down. There were all kinds of investigations. He got convicted, sent to prison. He actually escaped from prison once, and basically he was held in a jail. And he was a favored prisoner, had kind of his own room, his own apartment, basically. Everybody loved him. So he was a charming guy, and so he could talk people into things. But he was still beloved by many New Yorkers, even after all of this. And he had helped a lot of them as well. But it's true that he was corrupt and pilfering money from the public coffers. But I don't think he didn't get a life sentence. I forget what the sentence was. And there was an effort underway, his lawyers and friends, to try to get him sort of let out of prison. He's been there long enough. His health started to deteriorate, and it looked like it might succeed, except for, this is probably the main reason he never did get out of prison. He died in prison. Again, his health was deteriorating, partially because of the conditions. But a politician from New York, a reformer who wanted to see this kind of thing cleaned up, and his whole political career was based on campaigning. Hey, I'm a guy that's going to clean up the machine system and the corruption in our politics. That was sort of his main deal. A guy named Samuel Tilden, who later ran for president and lost, but was the Democratic nominee. And before that, during this period, was governor of New York for a time. So with this guy, right, Tilden, as governor, who was dedicated to ending corruption in politics, that was his whole claim to fame. There was no way he was going to be the guy that let Tweed out of jail, because it would seem to contradict everything that he stood for as a politician. So it ended up being, in many ways, bad luck for Tweed. Though I'm not trying to make you feel sorry for him. He did rip off the city and rip it off badly. But he does make an interesting character because there is something likable about him, and there probably was something likable about him in real life. And he did, the machine system did, as we've already noted, help people in certain ways. Good governments, or becomes known as the Goo-Goos, good government people, are the reformers. They were often Democrats, but there were some Republicans as well. And you see sort of one of each here. On the left, Charles Parkhurst, a reverend, but a political activist as well, not famous today. And on the right, the young Theodore Roosevelt, police commissioner, right, during part of this Gilded Age, for a short time, as I said, later to go on to be president of the United States. Parkhurst had sensational success fighting against the corruption of Tammany Hall. He investigated or gathered so much evidence, it led to a state investigation, which helped to defeat overall Tammany Hall in the 1894 election near the end of the Gilded Age. It didn't put a final nail in the coffin to the machine system in Democratic hands. This is long after Tweed was dead, but it hurt them badly, and sort of they never did totally recover from it. In the same election in 1894, this is when Theodore Roosevelt became president of the four-member police commission in New York. And when Jacob Riis, as already mentioned in this unit, became his kind of unofficial guide and kind of partner in trying to clean up the city. Roosevelt, a native of the city, but didn't know its poor neighborhoods because he came from a really rich neighborhood, and also said family had homes outside the city as well. Jacob Riis said, "I loved him from the first day I saw him." Theodore Roosevelt was unpopular these days, and whatever one can say on the positive and the negative side of the ledger, that both of them, there's plenty to say negative and positive about Roosevelt, but he was had an incredible personality, and almost everybody that knew him was struck by something special about this guy's personality. He had just a ton of energy, and sort of a real zest for life. Roosevelt saw vice and corruption sort of everywhere in the city, and believed in strict enforcement of the laws. He pushed Sunday closure of saloons, both as a political tactic to hurt Tammany Hall and as a way to break police corruption. And he was right. Saloon keepers, bar owners, routinely bribed police to ignore Sunday openings and other restrictions. But not surprisingly, also, closing saloons on any day of the week was widely unpopular. And eventually it sort of went away. And remember, Roosevelt didn't last long as police commissioner, not because he got fired, but he got a better job, Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the national level in the federal government. But he's a good example of one of many, a growing number of reformers that are trying to attack Tammany Hall in New York and other similar machine systems in other cities to bring about better government, not based on this kind of informal system of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And lastly, we see that cities are starting to become more modern in certain ways by and ways that we can recognize because of that, by providing more benefits and more services for their citizens. So I just use as an example, there are others, the public schools and libraries. American cities, according to Rourke, did not overlook the mind in their efforts at improvement. They created a comprehensive free public school system. By 1899, more than 500,000 kids attended school in New York's 5 boroughs. So a public school, free public schooling to 500,000 people by the end of the Gilded Age. And this is happening in other cities as well. But this really is kind of the beginning of public schools in American life. Also, in sort of helping to stimulate the mind, not just of kids, but of adults too, libraries began to open up. There were also free public libraries, which we still have. 1895 saw the opening of the free to all Boston Public Library with 700,000 books on the shelves. This is a modern picture of it, but that's what the inside looked like. So, I mean, just that, even if you're not an avid reader, which I can't understand why somebody wouldn't be, of course, as a professor. Not anyway, right? That's a fabulous building, just a fabulous room. Fun just to go hang out there. Was everyone able to equally benefit from these public institutions, schools, public libraries, other public facilities? No. And there was discrimination, racism against African Americans, got in the way of their being able to take full advantage of these public institutions, but prejudice against other groups as well, and poor people sometimes had problems even in free schools. Sometimes the schools were small and cramped, and depending on the neighborhood you lived in, not as professionally run, or not as many services, and so forth. So it certainly wasn't equal. and there certainly was discrimination, which of course is a big negative, but it was a start in the sense that it did sort of begin a public schooling that would only continue to grow in the country and spread from the big cities to other parts, to all parts of the country.